Good morning and God bless. It is Friday, 4:24 a.m. Still getting collected here. I am sort of blown away by my last reading. I read Fear and Trembling from Kierkegaard, and it talks about, and I'm going to try to sum it up. I don't even think I have the intellectual capacity to do that because it's deep in the broadest sense that I could think of, and deep in the darkest sense I could think of, which for me, darkness is the ultimate illumination, right? Well, let me do this. Been doing that in my recordings lately. I think it says an integral part of the Do You rules experience, time, right? Anyhow, I'm gonna try to make this succinct and valuable for you because I'm still trying to make it valuable for me, and I find myself struggling to do so. Some of the things that cross my mind is humility. I'm looking for my tools here because I don't have. There it goes. Okay. Looking for my chat bar so when folks come in to talk about faith. All right, so Kierkegaard in this book, if you know me, you know I've read the Bible, but I don't follow the Bible per se, right? I think it's a book more of metaphor than it is literal history. I once was told, which brought in my scope, read it to understand Christ consciousness. Now, I don't align with that principally either. I don't even know how to label my faith other than the fact that I have immense faith. And so Kierkegaard in this book talks about Abraham. Abraham, if you didn't know, had a son. His son's name was Isaac. If you didn't know also, he waited a long time for Isaac, I think 70 plus years or whatever it is. And his wife, and he and his wife finally had his son. Abraham's charge was to sacrifice his son. And one of the biggest things, especially as someone who sort of read in earnest the book of faith, if you would, I talked about this on a recent episode, sort of the ethical and optical illusion of society. Like we read things, we see things that have concluded. This story is over. And when the story is over, it's very easy to judge the ending because it's sort of happily ever after, right? The crescendo of the book is the crucifixion. And so we certainly align with the crucifixion and say it was required for saving. But yet, how many of us would actually go through the crucifixion if it was us to be crucified? And it's not insignificant because I believe the highest level of faith you can have in yourself is to crucify everything you think you know about yourself. And in psychology, if you read like Jung or sort of the archetype that comes into life and the possibility of individuation, this reality that you can become an individual, but in order for you to become an individual, you have to break down everything that you thought made you an individual until you came to the realization that you are seeking deeper individuality. And so all these things come into play. The shadow comes into play. The ego comes into play. The self comes into play. And if you come to a realization at any juncture in your life of where you might be, and you have sort of this epiphany that seems to be consistent with sort of the midlife crisis as far as how it's labeled, then there's an inflection point of like, yo, what am I doing? And am I living the way that I choose to live? And if you think about Kierkegaard and what he's talking about, faith, I also put in the title, there's a level of humility that has to come with this. But humility by no stretch means to not have confidence. Confidence, of course, can breed arrogance. This is where the archetype kind of comes in. Where's my ego? Where's my shadow? Where's myself in all this? Where is my faith? What do I truly believe? It's very simplistic in this regard. If your book was revealed to you and somebody opened you up to the last page and you knew the outcome, it'd be very much easier for you to move. Would it not? If you knew exactly what God had in store for you, you would move because you'd be like, well, I know where I'm going. But in the same way, in order for you to have faith, You got to know that God has a story for you. And yet we all know God has a story for us, but how much of us move in the direction of the story we believe for ourselves? That's what I'm sort of tugging on in my heartstrings and in my emotion. Like it literally, like I read some things sometimes and I don't know if I'm going crazy. This is faith too. I hope like the book was called Fear and Trembling, and I found myself, we talk about the nervous system a lot here. I found myself internally and emotionally shaking because these concepts hit hard. Faith, Abraham taking his son up a mountain over the course of 3 days and raising a knife above his son to sacrifice him for God. You hear that and you think, I would do that. How do you know that? You know that because you know the end of the story. But yet, in the same way as I just mentioned, there is an ending to your story. We can also, it's not a secret, we die. But also, I was reading last night, for the person to think that death is the end creates massive confusion for your life. It creates despair because if all we do is die, then what's the point? Faith. So let's go back just a little bit and let me talk about the humility of faith and how, some of this is tangible. In order to first identify that faith exists, you have to also simultaneously believe in faithlessness. Imagine that. Otherwise, how else would you know faith? So, in that way, faithlessness doesn't precede faith. You have to assume faith and then realize that I could be faithless in the process. And that paradox exists and should be the necessity that, or should be the urgency that provides a necessity for you to find faith. But now, if you consider the complexities involved in faith, I don't see, but yet I see, right? Like I know I want to do something. You can use me in the channel as an example, but I don't know that for sure this is going to work out. And in that same way, I have to move. That could be sort of a definition of faith in some capacity. The idea that you're getting into a relationship, you believe that the relationship is healthy, it's going to yield fruit. Otherwise, why get into the relationship? You don't really know. It's faith. You move towards creating a lifestyle for yourself. All of it requires faith. But now, what if it doesn't work? You have to consider that possibility to the greatest extent available to you because it might not work. And also, it not working might mean it may not work the way you actually see it, but yet you still see it. You see what I'm saying? I feel like you can sort of begin to put these things into circles, but it's relevant. It's relevant to the conversation. It's relevant to your life. It's relevant to how you move for yourself or not. The stagnation, the stasis, I always forget the word, man. Oh, it'll come to me. But our inner, the sort of freezing in our life. Why? Right? Why? And then we go back to Abraham and we take the reality that he had a clear mission and he believed he was sacrificing for God. And he believed that in order to sacrifice for God in faith, he had to give up his son. Could you really go through the pain and the suffering that would get you to the top of that mountain? You think yes, because you know the outcome. But he didn't know what was going to happen as he walked up. Now, one of the things that he also talked about in the book Kierkegaard was Abraham's ability to remain silent throughout the entire endeavor, that he didn't tell his wife, he didn't tell his son. And you think to yourself, why would he? How could he? Exactly. Why would he and how could he? And in that same way, if God has a story for you, you can't really speak on it. How could you? What do you really know? That, of course, is faith. Then I talked about the thought of humility. How humble do you have to be to follow a journey that you think is only for you? You can think it's arrogance that God has a journey just for you. But yet also in the same way, as I talked about with Jung and the archetype, we all seek individuation, individuality in some capacity. And most of us believe we have it. Otherwise, how would we identify? But a lot of that is ego driven as far as once you relinquish the I is the ego at the forefront. But yeah, I need that. I need that because if I didn't have it, how would I know what I needed to do in order to identify? And so paradoxically, the humility factor is immense because I have to believe there's something for me, that only I can do it, that I have all the skills, that I have the required traits, that I have the required faith to execute on this. But if I start to believe it's me and that I can't lean on God in the process, I break sort of from humility into arrogance. And we talked about on some of our recent episodes that, hype is helium. And when you start to believe it's just you and that you aren't carried by spirit, that's another big thing, right? How much of us believe that we are spirited today? Then arrogance is at the forefront, ego is leading, and the integration of self is not full and complete. And so you float away, right? So none of this brings, all of it, I think, brings me back to the concept of Abraham that I continue to wrestle with. As the author stated, he couldn't fathom that possibility, nor can I. As a father, I couldn't, I wouldn't. I say that out loud, right? Like, I got a message. I was told to sacrifice this. I can't do that because it's easy to sacrifice oneself. If you ask me to sacrifice me, I feel more inclined to believe I would do that. But yet, in the same way, a lot of us are asked to sacrifice ourselves, and I can ask you where you are with that sacrifice. Because the sacrifice for yourself, for everything you believe that you have faith for, is immense. And we can spell it out in different ways of what time does it require you to wake up? What level of effort does it require you to put in? What type of fortitude do you need? What type of discipline? All these buzzwords that come around, a lot of us lack it. Why do we lack it? Is it because we don't have faith? Is it because we are more aligned with our faithlessness? Is it because we see, but what we see is not what we really see because it doesn't belong to us, but yet it was given to us because how else will we know? Cryptic? Not really, if you think about it. So now, one could surmise again that you have an explicit requirement to fulfill a destiny, as we all do, spirited or not. And yet, as we see these sort of historical accomplishments, they all align principally the same way. One has a vision, one receives a message, one receives an idea, one has an understanding at the soul level that this is what I'm supposed to do. And yet, all of it requires a level of faith, which needs to be balanced across faithlessness, a level of sacrifice that requires you to relinquish yourself, a level of thought that you might be out of your mind and you won't make it, and that it doesn't make any sense, and yet you must proceed anyway. And then even as we see all these folks accomplish it, you ask yourself, how? There is no actual manual. There is no real book other than faith. But how do you how do you describe your faith? How do you have faith? It's like trying to explain your vision to somebody who is, they don't speak the same language, but they're in the same realm. They're under the same pressure. They're exposed to the same reality in some capacity, especially if they're within proximity. And yet, what do we do? What do we do? How do we find the answers? How do we proceed even when what we see is vague and cloudy and it doesn't appear to be built? Humility is a factor. But again, humility requires a level of faith to where it almost feels secretly arrogant and secretly misguided. Because then what else is faith? What else is humility? Like, humility is not shrinking yourself. It's not speaking down to yourself. It's not believing that you cannot. It's unwavering. But of course, in that way, as Abraham did, it's unwavering for a higher purpose, a higher cause. It has to be. It has to be. It can't be just for you. I think everything I've been exposed to and learned on my own or have tried to endeavor out in all aspects of my life, every time it's been bigger than me, it's yielded more fruit. It's the growth has been exponential in a way that's undescribable. And a lot of times it takes you to look back to realize what happened. You almost never see it as it's happening, which is difficult, which is why we talk about regularly the seed gets planted in the dark in the soil in order for the light to illuminate. In any event, I don't think inconsequential, I think massively critical to all of our lives, the ability to have faith that it may not all work out. Imagine that. Or faith that what's being asked of me is bigger, deeper, broader, and more difficult than language could ever put into context. Like the Abraham story, that aside from considering that God has made a request of you, right? That God made a request of you. You have something to do that God wants you to do. And then imagine you have something to do that God wants you to do for you. But it's not easy. It's not easy. It starts getting up here, it gets less in here, and in that way it gets convoluted. But aside from knowing that you need to sacrifice, the secrecy of the sacrifice, I think, is the last part I'll touch on that ripped at my soul, right? That imagine it's not as dire, that the request of you is something that sounds magnificent. You'd want to speak it out loud to the world. Like, oh, I got this thing that needs to be done and God told me to do it. It's going to be amazing. That would be easy. That's like seeing the end of the book before you get to the middle or the beginning. It's never that way. It's never that way. What you're being asked to do, only you can see. Feels arrogant. That's humility at its greatest definition. And then in that way, you can also know that everybody else who's just like you has the same mission to get the most they can out of this through God, the infinite. And I don't care if you call it God or if you tie it to a book or a religion or something specific. I'm not here to get dogmatic in that way. Everybody has an individual mission. Everybody seeks individual success. But in that way that you might know what you need to do, you might be acting on what you need to do and you can't speak a word of it. And that along the way, you might have to sacrifice yourself for everything around you and what that might mean to the people around you. And it could mean that the people around you right now aren't for you or won't yield or reap the benefits, the reward of the fruit. And that in the process, you might go down. You might reach a depth of darkness that is unfathomable to your soul, to your mind, to your spirit, to your experience. I don't know. This is what goes on in my head after I read books like this. Certainly what goes on at 4:42 a.m. And I thought I would offer you that. And if any of that makes any sort of sense, then we get back to our fundamentals of what we do here, which is how do we disrupt the noise? How do we disrupt what appears to be faithlessness? How do we disrupt the self-doubt that might block our ability to have faith and be humble enough to know that something bigger awaits us? How do we own the messages that only we hear and we see? How do we own our own vision? How do you yield and allow God or whomever you believe in at a higher level to take the wheel when necessary? How do we observe the constant shifts that occur in us emotionally, psychologically, all the things that make us us? And then how do we unleash anyway? How do we move and then move and then move? And that even when it's required for us to stop and rest, it is in a state of constant motion. All those things, complex, I know, required for sure. And if nothing else, the journey of you is always going to be worth it, right? That's what I got for you this morning. Change your mind, change your life. I am who I say I am.